All right, we are doing lesson 9-3, patterns and tables. So if you remember back to 9-1, you were given a table and all the values were filled in and then you had to graph it. This one's a little bit different and we are using a table to represent a number pattern. So if you take a look, this table below shows the distance a new car can go using different amounts of gasoline. How far can the car go using 4 gallons of gasoline? How far can it go using 5 gallons of gasoline? And if you remember, on Monday, we talked about, grab a pen here, this is the X side of the table, this is the Y side of the table. And what we're talking about the whole lesson today is what is the relationship between our X value and then what do we do to our X value to get the Y. So if we take a look, our X value is 1, we multiply it by 18.1 to get our value of 18.1. Take a look at this value. When X is 2, still we multiply it by 18.1 and we get our Y value. A common mistake often that 6th graders make is we say we're adding 18.1 every time. Well, in this case we are, but the relationship is from X to Y. If these X's did not go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the Y's would not consistently be adding 18.1. So keep that in mind. The relationship is always from X to Y. It's never Y to Y to Y to Y to Y or X to X to X to X. It's always how do we go from X to Y. Once we know how we do that, basically we can find any value. For any value of X, we can also find the value of Y. Now in this case, it's asking us how far does it go on 4 gallons of gasoline? Well, 4 is our X value. We multiply that by 18.1, and I apologize for the messy handwriting, but if you take out your calculator and you multiply 4 times 18.1, we find out that when X is 4, our Y value is 72 4/10 miles. On 5 gallons of gasoline, it's the same relationship. It's X times 18.1. So we take 5 times 18.1. Break out the old calculator. And that equals, and again, sorry for the messy handwriting, 90.5 miles. Pretty straightforward. And again, the relationship is how do you go from X to Y. Let's take a look at another example here. We have another table. We're going to focus on the top table at first. We need to find the values of P and Q in the table at right. And again, although this is an A column and a B column, we're going to get used to thinking about this in terms of X and Y. Now, if you take a look, we start at 1. How do we go from 1 to 18? And remember, like you'll hear me say this all lesson long, it's how do we get from X to Y? Well, right now I see 1. How do I get to 18? Well, what times 1 is 18? I'm thinking 18. We can check it. What's 4 times 18? That's 72. Hey, look, it works. So now, if we know X is 7 and we know our rule is X times 18 equals Y, well, if X is 7, we take 7 times 18 and we get P is equal to 126. Now, we look here, 12 times 18 is 216. Now, one of the interesting things is we know that multiplication and division are inverse operations. So if we multiply X to get Y, we can do the opposite we can take y divided by 18. If we're going the opposite direction, we're going to use the opposite operation, and we get 270 divided by 18, and voila, q equals 15. And we're going to wait on this table because this one actually shows up for your practice problems. But again, just a little hint so when you do your practice problems, think of this, the C, as your X row, and here is your Y row. And how do we go from C to D or X to Y? Once you know that relationship, you can find either one of these. If you're going from X to Y, whatever you do to go from X to Y, you do the opposite to go from Y to X. Just like up here, from X to Y it was times 18. Do the opposite to go from Y to X. We divide by 18. Pretty straightforward. And in our final example, we have a sequence of numbers, and we kind of skipped the sequence lesson, but it's the same sort of principle as these other ones. We have a sequence of numbers, goes 8, 16, 24, 32. Now, you might be saying, oh, we're counting by 8s. Well, you are, in a sense, but really, what you have is you have your first term, that's your x value, and then its value in the sequence is your y. So like the first number would be if x equals 1, how do we find our y value? We multiply by 8. Second term, if our second term is 2, which when you're just counting, your second term is number 2, multiply it by 8, 16. Third term times 8, 24. Fourth term times 8, 32. Now, initially, if I asked you, hey, if you're counting by 8, what is the 100th term? Well, you don't have to sit and count by 8 100 times. We know that in this case, that the x value, if we want to know what the 100th term is, if our x value here, because our term number is our x value, is 100, how do we find our y value? Multiply it. I'm trying to make the multiplication symbol. Multiply it by 8. What would the 100th term be? 800. And pretty straightforward. If you review, basically that is the name of the game today. You're given a data table, find your missing numbers. In our first example, we straight went one way, from X to Y, from left to right. Figure out how do you go from your X to your Y. It's going to be the same every time. You can use that to fill in your missing Y values. In our second example, here you had a missing X and a missing Y, and we found out first use an example where you have both an X and a Y, and we established it here. 1 times 18 is 18. We double checked it. Is 4 times 18 72? Yes, indeed. Now we know what the rule is. To get from X to Y, it's times 18. We use that to find our missing Y value, and then we also learned to go from Y to X, do the opposite, and divide. And in our last example, we found out that once you establish your relationship from X to Y, you can use that to find any term number. So we knew the first 4 terms, but now that we know it's just whatever the X value is times 8, we could use that to find the 100th term, or the 1000th term, or the 1,000,000th term. And so as long as you know that relationship between X and Y, you can figure out basically any value on either the X side or the Y side. For your homework tonight, once again, we have your basic homework. That'll get you straight 10 points if you get them all correct. And if this seemed pretty easy to you, same thing as yesterday, we have kind of your standard homework, but I've thrown in a couple of extra ones, plus an extra credit problem. If you get confused at all, refer back to the video, because every one of your homework problems fits either this example, or that example. And you can always look on the homework page. It'll tell you this is example 1, this is from example 2, or this is from example 3. And you can go back and look in your book too. Once again, there's your homework. Write it down in your planner and